In the name of the Father, the Son, the Holy Ghost. Amen. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus.
Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for us sinners now and at the hour of our death.
In the name of the Father, the Son, the Holy Ghost. Amen. Brethren in Christ, Laudate Jesus Christus. This is Timothy S. Flanders. I'm joined today by Dave and Timothy Gordon. Welcome to the show, brothers. How you doing?
What's up, Tim? Great. How are you?
Welcome.
Yeah, doing well. Thank you, Tim. Thanks for having us on and talking to us.
Yeah, so we're going to talk about the Gordon brothers' new book, Rules for Retrogrades, How to Defeat the Radical Left. So they wrote this book as a pretty much Michael Cirilla on the back says it's a compact art of war for all Catholics, Christians, and conservatives. So we're going to talk about why we need to declare war on the radical left, how we're going to win this war, and the Gordon brothers are going to explain how their tactics that they've come up with. Both of them have been maybe wounded by the radical left or attacked personally. And you guys want to share anything about what's going on with you and the attack against you personally?
Yeah, well, what you're hearing about me all of this week and before that, and being tremendously generous, I might add, is the typical story, the cancel culture. I was basically doxxed and attacked at my school for teaching what the Catholic Church teaches as against organizations, terrorist ones like Black Lives Matter, which is anti-Christian in its mission statement. And so people are being tremendously generous. They support what I'm doing, and they support what I'm teaching publicly and I guess formally, privately. So if you're interested in doing that, people out there, it's timothyjgordon.com. If you're interested, you can donate. And if you are more passive and you like something tangible for your dollars, please just purchase Rules for Retrogrades, because literally, people, it's been getting me through using the variant Rules for Retrogrades as against the radical left. It's a real fight, and people out there need to know how real the fight is.
Yeah, thanks for sharing, Tim. Dave, you want to share anything about that? I think you hear me, Dave?
Yeah, okay, I got you back now. The internet's spotty because I'm in an extended stay America hotel here in Detroit. So living the dream. The internet's a little spotty, so bear with me, guys.
Is there anything you want to share, Dave, about the attack of the left on you personally?
Do I still have you guys?
Oh yeah, I don't know, we're cutting out. Well,
okay, sorry. Yeah. So go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. If you hear me, go ahead.
No good. No goonsies.
Oh man, we're just gonna plow through. Dave, if you want to connect and reconnect or whatever you can do to
let me reconnect.
Okay, yeah, we're gonna get Dave back on, but first, want to start off with who is Saul Alinsky, and who is the radical left? What made you want to write this book, Tim?
Saul Alinsky was actually taken under the wing of Frank Nitti. Anyone who knows, he's kind of the right-hand man to Al Capone. And so-called community organizing, as homogenized as the term has been, euphemized, it comes directly from the mafioso factory. It's basically downstream mafioso organizing of inner city American cities. So the mob really had down to a perfect science exactly how to run a grift in American cities. And it was, alcohol at first when it was Capone. Later it became drugs, and of course the casinos. Don't bet against the house is the going slogan when you're talking about Las Vegas casinos on Tropicana, the old ones that were run by the mob. You can't win against the mob. Saul Alinsky took those odds, he applied them to the inner city, especially inner city blacks, right? And this is what Barack Obama and A.J. Ayers and community organizers were all about. It's what Black Lives Matter is all about. And it's a Marxist front group. It's really George Soros dollars go to it. You can track those dollars and see. And they want to destroy Christendom, what remains of Christendom, which isn't much. And that is to say, what remains of the Western family, private schools, human sexuality, the patriarchy, things like that. But they are and were, as a matter of fact, designated by the FBI in 2017 a BIE. So we get alphabet soup here. The FBI designated BLM a BIE, a Black Identity Extremist Group. And you can see the lineage really well, the ideological heritage from Frank Nitti, right-hand man of Al Capone, through Saul Alinsky, Black community organizing in the American Midwest. It works really, really well, because if you ask 9 out of 10 even so-called conservatives, they'll tell you they think BLM is some sort of innocuous group. Guess what? It's not. And my firing is just further proof of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely the mission statement, you can read the Marxism in it there, and people have been tweeting about this, and which is good. And why has Saul Alinsky and this left been successful against the conservative wing? Why has the conservatism failed? I think what I hear in your book a lot is a critique of the sort of mainstream conservatism that has prevailed for some decades. Why has it failed, and why did you need to write this book?
Well, mainly because conservatives, Christians, Catholics and Protestants are right. They're cowards. There's, cowardice lies close to the heart of man like a canker, and it's always there. And, it's a human condition thing, but particularly in the 20th century, the Marxist attack on the American heart, which is an Alinskyite attack. He's the central figure of American Marxism. And EWTN did a really great documentary on this, Wolf in Sheep's Clothes. He's the central guy. It has aggrandized American male cowardice and Western male cowardice into the new, effeminate maledom. And, most Christians think that to be a kind of savage who never lies, like William Wallace in Braveheart, would be a bad thing. No, to be a fighter is a bad thing. To be a guy that hits back or counterpunches is a pejorative thing. It's not. Rules for Retrogrades takes this on squarely. To go on offense is taken to be a bad thing. That's offensive. No, it's not. Rule number 1 in the book, this is Dave's rule actually, is always be on offense. Never apologize unless, you're in a state of mortal sin or something like that. Never compromise with radicals, because you always lose. Defense loses ball games, goes against the Greg Popovich philosophy. And number 5, circle the wagons around any conservatives or Christians that find themselves under attack, because the only way we can live is a kind of e-community, a virtual community where we all traffic with one another, come to each other's defenses. And generally speaking, we do good faith business with only other conservatives and Christians. This is where it's all headed, Tim.
Yeah, right on. Dave, are we coming through over there? Can you hear us?
Yeah.
Yeah. Anything to add?
Honestly, my internet's being so spotty right now. I apologize. No, I think Tim kind of smashed it on that one.
Well, one of the things you break down in the book are you break down the group, sort of the parties, into 4 groups. You have the radicals that we're talking about on the one spectrum, on the one side of the spectrum, and you have the retrogrades on the other side of the spectrum, and you kind of have these middle groups, which are the militant mod, which is on the left side, and then you have the mod con on the right side, and they're kind of in the center. Can you explain those 4 groups and how you understand them to be in modern political discourse?
Is Dave still getting better? Yeah, so it's basically far left, far right, the 2 poll members there, and then center left and center right. But what's notable in the architectonic, as we laid it out, Tim, is the idea that everything's slanting leftwise these days. So yeah, the militant mods are, they're center left, but they're more like left center left, right? Not to confuse everyone, but they have the upper hand. The the militant moderates over the mod cons, who are really more like center right, and that's because there's been this shift over the last 40 years leftwise. So even though you have kind of a radicalized moderate center left guys, they are emboldened, and even though you have mod cons that sound like they're just sort of center right, they're not emboldened. They feel impecunious, they feel pusillanimous, they feel weakened. And they are, because power perceived is power achieved. The only real solution to all of this, since what we're talking about is not actually viewpoint discrimination, the late great Nino Scalia's designation for a government violation of an individual person's First Amendment free speech rights. That's not what we're up against. That's not what I'm up against today, Tim. That's not what, it wasn't a government actor that violated my First Amendment rights. As a matter of fact, First Amendment rights are only valid against a governmental potential defendant. It was another private sector actor, and I don't have First Amendment rights against them. So it's a kind of what I call nuanced viewpoint discrimination. It's how the global left is acting. They're acting through employers. They're acting through private sector tattletales. The only response to this, because I don't favor using the public sector to treat it like I have a First Amendment right against another fellow private sector actor. I don't like that. I'm not with people on that. It's got to be a cultural moment, a grassroots thing. We're all just like, we're gonna talk like this. People like Tim. I'm with Tim. Tim says, who looks gayer, Father Martin or a bunch of BLM who are supposed to be risk averse, instead they're wearing the COVID masks. That's how guys like that talk. Look, if you want to play the identity politics game where we each have a tribe and rappers get to get away with saying the N-word, whereas anyone else would get fried for it, that's because that's their parlance. Well, that's my parlance, man. I'm a 39-year-old white straight male, Roman Catholic of Italian and Scottish descent. And guess what? I grew up in the 90s. If you need to look up what that means, then go look it up on, urbandictionary.com or whatever. I don't care what you do. But the point is, I'm not going to apologize for it. I'm not going to back off on it. I don't believe in identity politics, for one thing. But if that's the name of the game, then I'm going to stick by it. And I think it's really important for all of us to start saying that. They can't fire us all. I'll lead from the front. That's the thing. I just got fired. It's cool. I'll deal with it. What's important now is giving people an exemplar. I'm talking about not just Christians, not just Catholics. All Christians, all conservatives need a kind of example for someone that gets fired and stands by it boldly and is like, bring it on, man.
So the mod con really doesn't have the sand, doesn't have the gumption to really stand against the militant mod. Is the mod con, would you see that the conservative movement in the past 50 years in the United States to be just mod con?
Absolutely.
Just a bunch of mod cons than just.
Yeah, 95% of people that go around calling themselves conservatives are, or I'm a practicing Christian of one denomination or another. Most of them are mod cons, whereas most leftists are actually just straight up radicals. And the majority minority of those that aren't, but they're leftists, they're kind of just they're overt in the fact that their sympathies are left, they're radical left, and they're allowed to be left. They're just, maybe they're not going to the rallies or whatever. Maybe they're not staying out burning down police precinct buildings or stealing Air Jordans. But what they are doing is overtly pretty much saying, hey, I'm with these guys. So you see the difference there, the asymmetry. A center left has way more latitude for open operation than the center right.
Would you say that the one of the rules you have is the importance of allowing yourself to have enemies and
Absolutely.
being willing? It sounds like maybe the crux of what you're getting at here with the mod con is that the mod cons are not willing to have enemies. Is that one of the crux?
Yeah,
of what they are.
It's the paradox of first movement. So what you need is, it's fine to have enemies as long as you have guys watching your back, as long as you have your own army. And I'm not talking about army along racial lines or even religious lines. Here we're with our good Protestant brethren, as long as they're willing to fight. What we need is an open declaration of the way. Capitalize the T and the W if you want. And just say, look, man, this is it. This is a declaration of cultural war. Whether you're a post-liberal or a classical liberal or a kind of Catholic version of a little of column A and B, like myself, it doesn't really matter. We are here. We are Catholic. We're Christian. We're in America. It's the year 2020. The situation is dire, and like no LARPing. What we need to do straight up is be realistic in the appraisal of our situation. Say, okay, these people are, I'm locating my allies. These are people like our Braveheart moment, where we're just I don't want to hear about ideological parody or ideological comedy or ideological likeness. All I'm who's willing to go fight, right? Who's willing to fight the war? That's the kind of clan uniting that I'm all about. It's like whoever's willing to fight the devils, in the universities, in the entertainment and news media, and if necessary in the streets, that's always the last resort. Well, then that's what we're gonna have to do, because they're burning down our cities. I mean, this is like the wannabe terrorism of Robespierre, and no one's doing anything, Tim. I mean, it's crazy. The police were told to stand down.
Yeah, it's insane. Are you familiar with the Hays Code and the Catholic Coalition Against Hollywood from 1930 to 1965? Well, I mean, I think that's when you were talking about Protestants and Catholics, because in the 1920s, when the movies began to be pornographic, the Protestants tried to raise some kind of boycott against it, but they failed. And the Catholics rose up, and they were able to force Hollywood to just just cut out the pornography, basically. And I think it's an example of a little bit more of that coalition. But speaking of working with other Christians or conservatives, you definitely draw the line at the alt-right, and you exclude them entirely from any sort of conservative coalition, like Holy League or whatever we want to call it. And you praise the number of the American revolutionaries. Who would be the greatest retrogrades that you would see among the founding fathers figures? You've got Thomas Jefferson as one of them listed in the book. I'm wondering if you would you include people like Thomas Paine in that, or John Locke before them? What are some figures you'd see as the sort of models in this coalition?
Okay. I mean, look, in a war, there's a war. This is a weapon. It's an old expression by New York hardcore band Earth Crisis. Thomas Paine. See, this is the thing, man. In peaceful times for peaceful kind of weak men, that's not the times we're transitioning. Ideologically, Thomas Paine is not at all a fellow traveler, someone like that. But when he writes something like Common Sense that gets a bunch of dudes steeled up to ready to, the Sons of Liberty, ready to go get to business, he becomes, a wartime ally is a much broader genus, my friend, than a peacetime ally. That's what people out there need to understand. And I know a lot of kind of peaceful men have never even been in a street fight, and that's because we're taught that's a bad thing. That masculinity's kind of been on trial, and now we're fluctuating into a warp mode where it's actually good. You want some kind of roughnecks that have been in street fights, that understand that the wartime allies are a much broader genus. So, I mean, my favorites are George Mason, the great Virginia, some of the great Virginians, James Monroe, George Mason, the Francis Lightfoot Lee, the anti-federalist brother of the Federalist Lee. These are some of the very best. And of course, Patrick Henry, who was old by the time of the ratification of the Constitution in 1788, the framing era and the founding era of the 70s and the framing era of the 80s, 1780s are different things, because it's, a decade and a half later. But it's really important to understand that, the reason that, hey, I mean, on the same token, what I just said about Tom Paine, he wouldn't be a peacetime ally, he'd be a wartime ally. Some of these, alt-right figures. There's alt-light and there's alt-right, you know. I mean, like, I'm associated with Milo Yiannopoulos and, you know, Gavin McInnes. I'm going to go visit with those guys on Monday. Milo published my first book. Milo is not alt-right. That's a slur when it's used in regard to Milo. There's not, you know, there's no racism there. No, you know, again, there's a kind of quickening, a kind of broadening of who I would be willing to consider an ally, because we're at war with these devils. You know, the Marxists, the Jacobins in the streets who are organizing all this. But yeah, not a racist. The reason you can't, even in wartime, really compromise with someone fighting in your direction as a racist is because they'll quickly turn against you, right? There's the principle, and you never compromise on principle, but also just practically, they'll turn against you if there's someone in your own camp that's working in the same direction with someone like a true alt-right racist. You're going to have, you know, division in the ranks. So as a matter of principle and as a matter of praxis, yeah, that's an absolute rule. There's no. It's hilarious, by the way, that I got. I mean, I have this. I made front page in my hometown paper. Bakersfield is not as small a town as Los Angeles today. We're a top 50 American city by size, and literally last weekend this came out. Front page of the Californian, man. People are howling for my blood in my not that small city. You know, it's might be intimidating to some, but. Yeah, so we need allies, and we need an open declaration of who they are. And it's ironic because I said there's no room for racism in the new American right, the ascendant right, the rising tide which catches all boats.
Yeah, that's a really great point about the genus of, I can't remember how you pointed that with the genus. The ally in wartime is a greater genus than in peacetime. It seems, I don't know much about the alt-right, but yeah, they seem to be basically like kind of a conservative pagan movement, basically.
Yeah.
That wants to sort of revive a pagan mentality and preserve their conservatism, is trying to conserve their pagan roots, which is diabolical in many ways, obviously. So I wanted one more curious question about particular figures, because we have the figure of Jacques Maritain, who is presenting, he basically is the architect of Vatican II. He wants to sort of strike some kind of compromise with the secular liberal world, and liberal in the broader sense of the term. And then he admires Alinsky somehow. I don't know how, but
they're personal homies.
Yeah, they're like, yeah, I don't know how he does it, but would you put Jacques Maritain's efforts to sort of have this compromise with the world, how would you put him? Would he be a mod con in your mind?
Yeah, no, I would say Jacques Maritain is a center left, you know, militant moderate. I know a lot of people growing up, even in sort of decent Catholic universities, the semi-decent Catholic universities, were taught Maritain was good Thomist, but for one thing, he wasn't, in terms of Thomas's the way Thomas's ethics translated to his politics. But moreover, just he wanted to make an unbridgeable compromise that can't be made, and you know, no one's right of center can be a compromiser of that type. And you know, he's close friends with Pope Paul VI, and did a lot of negative stuff. So no, I wouldn't put him center right. I'd put him center left, maybe disguising himself as center right.
Okay. And what would be the crucial, because we just talked about kind of the pagan alt-right that's crossing the line. We're not going to ally with them. So where did Jacques Maritain cross the line to go over to the left side? You mentioned ethics, for example. What in particular do you see him moving over to that left side?
Well, I mean, when we talk about weaponized ambiguity, a lot of this ends up coming from a Maritainian equipoise. It's, you know, he didn't write the documents, and you know, so if you go through the sacred documents of Vatican II, some of them are almost as bad as we say on the Catholic right. Others aren't nearly as bad, but he didn't write any of them or ratify any of them. He just stands for the sort of, he's more like a figurehead of the sort. I forget the exact rubric under which you addressed Marathon, but he is in some ways kind of a centralizing figure of Vatican II, and he represents the kind of gambit that's typically made by a militant mod. He's just often kind of known as center right, and he's been characterized that way by church history books of the last 50 years.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, he's such an interesting figure, and it is interesting that in '67, after the council, he does a little bit of a mea culpa, and he does say that we're now kneeling before the world. So he sort of sees something there, which is interesting. So one more question about people is Trump a retrograde?
Trump's got the powerful rhetoric of the retrograde and has the fighting spirit of the retrograde. Indeed, like to see a restorative effort. It kind of vanished around February, March for COVID. I see it coming back somewhat. And, he said today that most governors and mayors in the afflicted cities by these arsonists and rioters, they underreacted or something like that. He said they needed to be stronger. So that's retrograde indeed. We'd like to see a real restorative effort on the part of Trump and his handlers. Not the biggest fan of Kushner here. I think everybody is kind of an average of the 5 people they're listening to the most. We're all subject to it. I'd like a restorative effort to Trump when he came in 2016, first 6 months of 2017. That was retrograde, and I think he'll return to that. I wouldn't be shocked if he gets a second term if we saw a conversion to Roman Catholicism in the second term. I'd be stoked.
Yeah, that's the dream. We'll offer that up in our Father at the end of this show.
Truly,
conversion of Trump to the faith.
Pray for it.
So Tim, what is your favorite rule? You mentioned earlier that you've been using the rules in your personal struggles right now with the left. What are some of your favorite rules that have been helpful to you personally, or just that you think are pretty great?
My very favorite rule is what Dave wrote in rule number 1. I insisted that it goes number 1. Just always be on offense. It starts out like, chess grandmasters know it, military generals know it. Both offensive and defensive football coordinators know it on a football team. It does not matter how good you can have the best defense in the NFL, right? And it's actually fallacious to assume that defense wins championships, which became a rejoinder that's can be misleading, especially for people of a conservative nature. It doesn't matter in football, especially if let's imagine a football game where you have infinite downs, not 4. It doesn't matter how good the defense is. They can get a 1.5-yard run play up the middle every time. And with infinite tries, it doesn't matter how good that defense is. The opposing team will score. And the only way to play true defense is offense back. Same thing Dave talks about. Boxers know it. The only good boxers that can succeed in the heavyweights, I'm not talking about the little light guys because they do so little damage to each other, but in the heavyweights, the only real defense is offense. You got to be a counterpuncher. It's how Andy Ruiz beat AJ that first time, man. Now, he got whooped the second time because AJ adjusted the strategy, but he's just a fast little, he's not little, he's fast, chubby little counterpuncher. And he caught AJ big a couple times. Counter-punching works. It's the only offense is the best defense. And the way Dave wrote up that rule really, really took my breath away. It's right. Rule number 1. My favorite one I wrote is Risus Bellum Est, laughter is war, because what conservatives and Catholics have to get their heads around is that even often with other Catholics on Twitter, a lot of people don't want dialogue. Dialogue we kind of laugh at, we snicker at it because it's this Francis pontificate like farce term. When you're dealing with a good faith actor, they really do want dialogue, and dialogue does work. But there aren't that many good faith actors. So when you're dealing with a radical leftist, none of them want dialogue. It's the issue is never the issue, as Dave says in another one of his rules. So when they throw something at you, like, oh, you said this, are you a racist? I said I'd do one local interview. The rest of my interviews are with national people who are basically friendly to me. My not small hometown press is slandering me, has been slandering me for the last week and a half, right? I did one where I was, you can go listen to it. I tweeted it out. with this local AM radio guy. I was on offense the whole time because he was pretending like he was pseudo neutral, but he wasn't. I'd listened to what he was tweeting and saying up to in the days in the run up to the interview. It's not the best thing you can do to a stupid question like, so are you a racist, Tim? That's stupid. I laugh at that. I'm not a boomer, man. I'm not even going to dignify that with any answer. Everyone writes no. Go check Rule 38 in my book. You know, if you want to waste your own time, because you probably don't want to read what I wrote. Go check Rule 38. But next question, I'm not even going to respond to that. You're stupid. You know.
Right. Yeah. It was. I think you said that ridiculous. The word ridiculous means it's something that is subject to ridicule.
Yeah.
And you really, I think, draw out the left's tactics really well in the book and talk about that they're just trying to manipulate the emotions of the public. Basically, they're not even interested in sort of rational discourse. And so I think that it is a good point to just say that we're going to laugh at this attempt to manipulate the rational discourse, because lowering ourselves to that level is going to just degrade everybody and degrade the discourse. And just for the listeners on the podcast, we did have Dave drop off. Unfortunately, he had some internet issues and we couldn't get him back on. So sorry, Dave, but Dave is always welcome, of course. But I want to get to there's a essay from 1998 by John Hardin, and it's called "The Influence of Marxism in the United States." And he makes the claim in 1998 that the United States of America is the most powerful Marxist country in the world. And the reason he asserts this is because of, as you point out, the errors of Russia are not only an economic thing, but you're also talking about egalitarianism. And he goes into all the other kind of aspects of Marxism. So would you agree with John Hardin? To what degree would you say that Marxism has taken hold of America?
It's a strong rhetorical flourish. If we were to quantify, right, the vitality of Marxism in the variant nations, no, I wouldn't agree. If we're to receive Hardin's expression of America as a powerful Marxist place, or a superlatively powerful Marxist place, then I would say, well, the greatest trick the devil's ever pulled is to convince the world he doesn't exist. The greatest trick that the Marxists ever pulled, just ask Bella Dodd or Alice von Hildebrand, is to convince people that Marxism is only an economic thing. It's also socialist, it's also a social movement. And America has had its institutions stormed to the extent that basically all people who designate themselves conservatives are what I'd call center right at most, are basically mod cons, as in the book. And that's that's not effective. That's devastating. It's devastating that 19 out of 20 people I run into, if they hear me talk, they're going to be like, wow, this guy's extreme. I'm not extreme at all, man. I completely repudiate the alt-right and all the ideas of the alt-right, and even the jokes of the alt-right, even though I like most forms of humor, but even the jokes of the alt-right, like, no, that's a bridge too far, man. But I'm not an extremist. I'm just a hardcore conservative. I'm a retrograde. And so, yes, Hardin's rhetorical flourish there is true when received in the sense that America has been infiltrated with Marxism to the extent that you have a bunch of mod cons running around calling themselves, hey man, I'm just right of Attila the Hun. And they're nothing more than mod cons, because when you're like, okay, cool, can we talk about demographical crime rate? Oh no, we don't talk about that. Another one of Dave's rules is no fact is off the table. Can we talk about demographical crime rate? Look, I'll talk to you about George Floyd. That cop could probably get murder one, but it's not a race issue. He probably could get murder one. I don't know why people are saying he can't. But if you want to do a deep dive into this, let's get real. I'll get real with you, man. Let's talk about demographical crime rate. Let's talk about demographical murder rate. Let's talk about out of wedlock birth rate by demographics. These are the feeder constituencies of crime. And we can't get real talking about, police interactions with black people or white people or pink people if we're not talking about the incipient ground for the what we call Terry stop in the law, right? We have to talk about, okay, was the Terry stop justified or not? When the cop pulled that guy over, did he find drugs on him or not? No one wants to talk that way. And it's not, liberals aren't going to do that because it disfavors their mode of argumentation. Conservatives are the ones in an adversarial system of both law and media. That's our duty. That's our job to say, okay, well, let's talk about the crime rates. Let's talk about all the things I just raised. And they're the ones not representing, sticking up for their own part. And it's feckless. And it turns my stomach.
Yeah, man. I wanted to get into my favorite rule that I have is what you talk about language. And I mentioned this before when you were on the show before, but you said that so you said page 37, language is a tool for communicating truth. If language is manipulated, then truth is manipulated. I think the thing that I see in the mod cons the most of all is there is a compromise with the language. We're willing to use all their euphemisms, all their terms. We just use them, and it's kind of a language that everybody understands, and they know what you mean when you say abortion. Everybody knows when you say it. But I wanted to ask you just sort of if there's other changes in language that you would advocate. So like we've got pornography, we've got abortion, euthanasia, sterilization, contraception, feminism. And we also have the Novus Ordo buzzwords like dialogue, ecumenism, interfaith dialogue, accompaniment. We also have historical terms like the Enlightenment. So any changes in the language that you would advocate? I think that the biggest one that comes to mind that is actually practiced among Catholics is the term Protestant revolt instead of Reformation, because we don't consider that a Reformation. Would you change any of those words?
I think I'd change all of them. The ones you just listed. I mean, I'm on board. When we talk about the history of thought, the Dark Ages being the time when the Catholic Church ruled the world versus the Enlightenment are particularly offensive, particularly egregious, right? We all know dark's bad. We all know light's good. And when we talk about what happened to reason in the Enlightenment, it's particularly duplicitous because reason got, I'd use a bad word here if I were on a different podcast, but reason got destroyed. When we talk about the deliberate Cartesian, Baconian eradication of formal and final causation, two of Aristotle's four forms of causation, the two most important ones, from basically human scientific discourse forever, intentionally thrown under the bus in the Enlightenment. Reason gets destroyed without the two most important of the four Aristotelian causes when we discuss systematically what something's ideology or its teleology are. You can't tell what it is. So we don't know what things are anymore, or we don't even have the categories because of the Enlightenment. It was the ultimate attack on reason. In the so-called Dark Ages, conversely, the four Aristotelian causes, the top two are formal and final causation. These are the true intelligibility and goal of a thing. And it was not dark at all in the Dark Ages. Yeah, we didn't have the technological niceties or the medical comforts that we have nowadays. But discourse was robust and good, and therefore it's truth stood on its head diametrically when we talk about the Dark Ages versus the Enlightenment. But I agree with all the ones you say. The Protestant Reformation is also one of the rank offenders way up there in terms of egregiousness, because Reformation means something from within, and it's a non-pejorative. It's a net positive. Obviously, the true Reformation happened at the Council of Trent and the Catechism thereafter of Trent, when we really truly, reformed our ideas, and we, the new Jesuit order was formed and charged up and went out and clearly articulated Catholicism for the next 150 years or so in response to the Protestant revolters. But yes, it's a revolting overturn of the proper use of what a reformation is, lowercase r.
Yeah, that's a really good historical point with Dark Ages versus Enlightenment and Enlightenment. So for viewers, Cartesianism is essentially the denial that you can trust your own senses to tell you that something is happening outside yourself and it's real. It's got basically the denial of reality, basically on a philosophical level, which is basically irrational. And so it is just an age of darkening that's not Enlightenment at all.
What's interesting, Tim, is that when you take a secular history philosophy class, they say, well, the Enlightenment has these, two poles, the North Pole and the South Pole. Empiricists, the empiricists were guys. The first one was Francis Bacon. I said Baconian. You can only trust a posteriori reason, basically what you can measure. And the opposite pole, the South Pole, would be the rationalist. The first one was Descartes, who says reason alone, a priori reason alone. And they sound like opposites. But the interesting part is both Bacon and Descartes, and pretty much all the Enlightenment thinkers, opposed though they were in terms of their epistemology, when they discuss what's the true origin of our knowledge, is it reason or is it experience? Yawn, who cares? It's a boring epistemology class. But all of them agreed that we needed to jettison going forward, and we did, formal and final causation. Aristotle was the big opponent of the rationalist Enlightenment thinkers and the empiricist Enlightenment thinkers. That's how you kind of skip that boring chapter of early modern history. You just say they're all opponents of Aristotle, and they wanted to get rid of him in the history of philosophy textbooks, and they did, mostly.
Yeah, and it's all just a rebellion against reason itself and rationality. That everyone, even if they are a Cartesian or a rationalist or whatever, they have to use their reason to get out the door in the morning and eat their breakfast and go to work and all this stuff. They have to use all these things and set all these assumptions at the side, even though they're pushing them in their treatises and whatnot. But
right.
I want to get over to some further controversy, and this is something that comes from not mod cons, but the other Catholic retrogrades, if you will, which are the integralists. And something that you kind of touch on here and there in the book is the social kingship of Christ. Page 35, you dismiss separation of church and state as a Marxist rhetoric. You praise the darkling genius of Christendom. And I want to get a little bit more your thoughts on this in terms of the integralist movement, and if you would count them as wartime allies as well in this whole struggle.
Yeah. Well, so they're really tough to categorize because they're so confused. That's the problem. Integralists, generally speaking, the leaders of the integralists, like Pat Deneen and to some extent Adrian Vermeule at Harvard Law, they always are kind of flirting with not being integralists. So it's a difficult designation to make. Again, no one really has the proper categories. Dig this, though. So in 1791, when the Bill of Rights, the first 8 amendments to the U.S. Constitution were passed, none of them were to be incorporated as against the state legislatures. And this was very important. This was not an oversight on the part of the founders and framers and ratifiers of the Constitution. Those first 8 amendments were only imposed against the federal legislature, which is the Congress, right? So the First Amendment has all these different clauses going every which way, but the so-called supposedly 2 religion clauses, the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause, they weren't really seen as opposed back then. That's a modern development.
And just for our international viewers, that clause is Congress shall not make any law. If you can quote it verbatim, go ahead.
Yeah, respecting any establishment of religion. It's for domestic and abroad listeners who might not know, it's the only of the 8 amendments which were demanded by the Anti-Federalists at ratification 3 years prior. We'll ratify the Constitution, but we demand a Bill of Rights. It was the only one that actually mentioned Congress. So what I'm about to say is rendered explicit, that Congress, the federal legislature, was not allowed to make a law respecting an establishment of religion. By establishment of religion, we mean an official state religion, lowercase s in this case. But the state legislatures were. And guess what, Dr. Deneen, Professor Vermeulen? They did. 8 of the 13 state legislatures, 8 of the 13 states, for the first, really, for the antebellum America, which means between the Revolutionary War and the Civil War, had official, I guess, integrations of variant sects of Christianity. People don't know that, so it's a historical fact. It also is a real stumbling point for people that claim that the founders and the framers were Masonic. Something like 11 of the 56 signers of the Declaration were, but they didn't get their druthers, and this is the proof, right? Because their main thing was reifying a hard separation of church and state, and they ended up getting their way, but it was very, very recent on the historical continuum. It was in 1946 in a Supreme Court case called Everson versus Board of Education, where the Supreme Court self-consciously overturned the meaning of the First Amendment, and they said so. We're reversing it. Now we're incorporating the Bill of Rights against state legislatures, which way tipped the balance of powers toward the federal, because now it was supposed to be something that was only delimiting the federal, not the states. Now it was delimiting the states as well as the federal. So now state legislatures couldn't reify establishments of state religion. Now, yes, I get it. I mean, all the people out there are saying obvious stuff if they've heard this before. Well, 8 out of 13, that's not all of them. No, but subsidiarity, only the states that wanted to do so in their legislatures could. That's how subsidiarity works. 2, another aspect of subsidiarity is, yeah, most of the people in the United States were Protestants. So they're either Covenantists in the North or Anglicans in the South. But the point is, the United States Constitution was not founded as against soft integralism. So I'm not against soft integralism. I wouldn't oppose state establishments of religion. And as long as there can be one of 50 states that's got a Catholic state religion, I'd probably move there and then just say, look. But I mean, another point, so that kind of proves the whole thing, that the Supreme Court had to wait till 1946. 7 of the 9 justices were Freemasons on the court. The next century, in the 50s, it would be 8 of 9. They had to do it then. But the founding, the framing, the way Deneen and all those guys say, it was all Freemasonic nonsense. Why would they have done that? It was the First Amendment. The first thing they got to was making sure that there could be a soft integralism. The reason I'm against hard integralism, Tim, is because I would trust Trump making laws, as a kind of aristocratic consul before I would trust Pope Francis, right? Pope Francis, if he was in charge of everything now, we would have one world government and an eco council and eco enforcers that go door to door, and there'd be no borders. So just because it's personnel is policy, just because we're talking about the church, people know better than me. Actually, I think this is kind of a funny conundrum with some of the traditionalists I argue with is, hey man, monarchy, like Thomas Aquinas says, is the best form of government when it's good, but it's the worst when it's bad, when it goes bad. And the popes for the last 50 years have not been good, and people are dissenting louder than I am at the badness of the recent popes. Though the Roman Catholic Church is the one regime on planet Earth that must be a monarchy. All the secular ones can be one of like 3 types.
So are you saying that hard integralism would be state church on the federal level? Would just be like an official United States state church, basically, or some kind of a respecting of religion? Is that what you're calling hard integralism versus soft integralism? State churches on the state level?
Yeah, that's one distinction I would make. Is I don't really favor anything on the federal level. Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution gives like 15 or 16 scant powers to the federal government, the rest of it because of subsidiarity, an absolute principle, according to Pope Pius XI, never violable, right? You only kick a power up if it's not capable of being done at the lower level. And so state governments should be the ones with that power. And we have that in the US Constitution. It's just ignored. And number two, by hard federalism, hard integralism, what I wouldn't favor is something that would have been extrinsic to the 8 of 13 states that had soft integralism when they had it. Namely, there's no persecution of non-whatever type of Protestants, covenantalists in the North or Anglicans in the South. It's just literally, it is an establishment in the sense that the state duly and officially recognizes it. You could, I mean, they weren't coining their own money by the time we had the Constitution, but if you're coining money, you could put a little Protestant slogan of the fashion of whatever sect is fondest, whatever's established on the money. You could put it on the buildings. You could have a set of cultural assumptions that run concomitant to the political creatures and strictures of whatever state you're in. But that doesn't mean persecution of others. A lot of Catholic LARPers get excited and they say, "Oh, well, you know, we need to be like the Holy Roman Empire." The Holy Roman Empire was very, very similar in terms of its anti-persecutionism of non-Catholics as the American states, the 8 states that had the First Amendment before the First Amendment was incorporated against the state governments as well, which was another 14th Amendment travesty after the Civil War.
Right on. So I was going to ask you about the National Reform Association of the 1860s. That was a Protestant, for viewers, that was a Protestant movement that arose during the American Civil War in the 1860s, which believed that the Civil War was God's wrath because the Constitution did not acknowledge Christ the King. And so they advocated for an amendment to the Constitution to acknowledge Jesus Christ as the King of the United States. So it sounds like you would not agree with that as on the federal level. Is that correct?
I mean, I wouldn't oppose it because it's still soft integralism, right? I mean, I think it would be pretty based to have an acknowledgement of Jesus Christ, because that's non-sectarian, right? I mean, all Americans in 1791, aside from a few kind of rogues that flirted with deism but didn't even say it very loudly, like Jefferson or Paine, they're all Christians of one stripe or another. It is a Christian nation. They only got specific about their sectarianism, when in those 8 states. But no, that would fall under what I'd call soft integralism, and I would favor it. I think it would be pretty dope to have a
right.
Yeah, I mean, this is what we need, man. We don't get it any better on the Catholic right than we do in society at large. It's distinctions within distinctions. People want stuff simple. Because I know a lot of these things about American history and even church history, aside from some bright pages in the church history textbooks that people favor looking at. It's not fun. It's work. But distinctions within distinctions is really the only way to get to the truth. It doesn't mean you can't generalize. It just means, soft integralism isn't what the integralists are favoring. It's a LARPier thing than that. But no, I would favor that, absolutely. I absolutely am known for wanting a return to the original meaning of the Constitution before all of these institutions and constitutional creatures got corrupted around the time of the Civil War. I think more than anything, the Civil War probably was God's wrath for slavery, and his curse was the 14th Amendment, which pretty much destroyed everything. But, people on the other side figured, hey, we have to do it because the states are having slavery. That's a whole other topic, though.
Yeah, definitely. So you would, so as I understand, I'm not familiar with the 1946 case you're referring to. I mean, I know I've heard you speak on that before, but are you saying that, I think there was a state in the Northeast that had a lot of Catholics. I think it was Vermont or New Hampshire, if it was something they were all flocking there. I can't remember which it was, but let's say there is a state that has a ton of Catholics. They democratically elect their whole Congress and their governor, and everybody's Catholic. And then they vote in their state constitution to acknowledge Jesus Christ as Lord and officially recognize the Catholic Church or whatever. So would that then, the federal government would then come down on them based on that 1946 ruling?
Precisely. So the nationalists, the one that are saying, oh, let's run everything through the national power, however unconstitutional and subsidiarity be damned, they don't get it. No, this is the whole point. This is why all of the meaningful laws and regulations need to be made at the state level. So if you're in a state that goes, I don't know, Satanist, or skip that, just Protestant, right? You move to an adjacent state that's Catholic, and I mean that's a really meaningful thing that you can do. It's an option that's always at your disposal. And you get together with a bunch of your friends and you make this vote up. The state of Maryland, it never was integralist Catholic, but it was close to having the quorum necessary to do that. You go to Maryland, you have the people there, you're the little republic. It's an imperium in imperio. That's the idea of federalism, is a little government within a government, states within the Fed. And you celebrate because you accomplished what you set out to, and now with subsidiarity you can have your little Catholic Republic of Maryland or whatever. Well, no, the federal government comes right over the top with the Supreme Court by use of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment and the second Due Process Clause. The first one's in the 5th Amendment. The second one of the 14th Amendment now constrains states, something called the Incorporation Doctrine, and they shut you right down. And it's just nine rogue tyrants on a bench that make this decision, or really the expression we use in constitutional laws, can you count to 5? A bare majority of 9.
So would you, if we can't get the Supreme Court back, and I mean Trump gets reelected, but then after him we get Clinton too, or whatever, or whoever else, God forbid. Would you? I mean, is it time for secession at this point? I mean, that's basically what I all but say it in Catholic Republic. My friends and I guess close allied hearts who read the book are like, you all but say it. As you come, it's just one way or the other. Hopefully peaceably. Basically, it's time for balkanization, right? And this is why I'm always quoting Jefferson, even when he's vice president. He cited his anti-federalist friends from the decade before when he was like, look, the 3 types of anti-federalists, who opposed the immediate ratification of the Constitution in 1787-88, the 3 types, the more extreme ones, wanted 13 separate countries. All the 13 states were countries. That's the most extreme. Then the middle type wanted like four segments that were like 4 separate countries. Divide the 13 states into like a North America, a South America, a West and East, or something like that. And then the more moderates, like George Mason said, well, we can do 13 states in one union, but we need a Bill of Rights, and that's what ended up kind of happening. I favor something more like the middle, right? A continent-sized republic of the type of government smiled on by Aristotle, Plato, Cicero, Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, Bellarmine, Suarez, Juan de Mariana, and Montesquieu. All these thinkers in the direct natural law line of natural law thinkers that said republics are good. There are some basic cardinal rules. Montesquieu lays them out really nicely. 1, republics have to be small. So yeah, definitely not the size of a continent. A continent-sized republic like we have now, that doesn't work. 2, they have to be univocal. They have to be like one voice, one moral, and that really means religious voice. So you need to be a Republican denizen with people that agree with you. So the idea of a Catholic republic is a really good idea. It's got to be pretty small, though. And the 3rd one is you need separation of powers. You can't have collusion among the 3 branches. It's not quite as relevant to this discussion. But yeah, balkanization seems to be the only way. And what I said about Jefferson, he would quote it as vice president. And I think even in 1802, when he was president, he said, the future of American happiness depends not upon one union or several leagues of friendship, meaning, in America divided into kind of 4 that are actually the countries, the sovereign nations. He said, hopefully we'll always be friends, but I could see going either way. All right, we tried union. It got destroyed after the Civil War because of the 14th Amendment. And I would just say now, who's holding this together, right? We've seen the riots on television. These are not
our countrymen. It has nothing to do with race. It has more to do with what we believe. What is the res publica, the thing holding us all together? Well, a believing Roman Catholic, or I'd settle for just any kind of hardcore Christian at this point, is the only person I could really call a citizen of the res publica I believe in.
Awesome. I want one more big question for you on a slightly different angle of this, and I want to take questions. So, viewers, if you guys want to ask Tim any questions about the book or anything, what would you see as the retrogrades? What is the role of charity in? Is there any hope for converting the left and these souls that are blinded by the devil, and the preaching of the gospel? Those two things, charity and the gospel. What do you see as the retrograde using those things?
Well, yeah, I address this really specifically in chapter 3, I think, or rule 3, I guess. It's when you do public debate, and people have heard me debate. I'm pretty tenacious, even with friendlies, not just hostiles. I've also done very public debates with hostiles. You're really trying to win the mod cons to a stronger position, or maybe the militant mods. It would be amazing if you win over the hardened, calloused, heart cankered leftist, the radical that you're arguing against. And it has happened, and it's happened with me, by the way. But usually you're making a kind of wage for the heart and the mind of the centrists in your audience. Now, I address this. I say, if you find yourself trapped in an elevator for hours with a leftist, a radical leftist, and it's just you two, or you get into a jam and you get out together, some adventure that would be in the plot of a movie, that's your golden ticket. That's your golden opportunity to really evangelize this lost soul when there's no one else around. Because remember, leftists, radicals are demagogues. They are sophists. They're really good at it too. They're way better than us. They're playing for the ears, the eyes, the hearts, and the minds of the audience. And so when there's other people around, you're using the leftist you're debating with as a prop to get everyone else in the room. And if they express any openness, the slightest aperture to the truth, you hit them with it. And that's when the charity kicks in. But in a public debate setting, which I'm quite familiar with, I've done this a long time, you got to be a bulldog. But yeah, especially if they evince any kind of physical indicia, or in their physiognomy or anything, or they explicitly state, hey, I'm kind of interested. This has happened to me. Or if you just find yourself in a weird once in a lifetime situation in an elevator and you get out or something, you kind of bond over that. And then you're like, hey, I noticed you have like bluish pink hair. You're probably a radical leftist. Let me tell you. That's a good opportunity. And that does happen. But no, usually in charity, your job as a Christian is to convert all the rest of the world. Remember, Tim, when St. Paul wasn't making such good inroads with the Jewish Christians who are kind of getting caught up in purity spirals, which are my least favorite things, who did he take it to? The Gentiles, right? And the Gentiles were actually easier for him to evangelize to, and they're greater numbers. So it's a numbers game. We're going for hearts and minds, and Satan is the real opponent. And the left, the radical left, they are ingenious demagogues and radicals.
Yeah, I think there is a great truth to what you're saying. It reminds me of our Lord saying, "Cast not thy pearls before swine, but be wise as serpents." And it really is, especially when you're in a crowd and you have the public, and the left is very much attuned to the praises of men and wanting to appear this or that. It's very difficult, especially when men are blinded by their own sin or whatever, to hear reason. But there are those moments where you can get an open door to really share the gospel and give someone the charity of Jesus Christ, and which can convert people and has. So I'm going to get to some questions. I've got Christopher says, do we all need to relocate in a quasi-Benedict option? So this is Rod Dreher's idea of kind of secluding ourselves somewhat, which was a movement of St. Benedict in the I believe the 500s, if memory serves. What do you make of that? What's your opinion of the Benedict option, Tim?
Congregating together with like-minded individuals is just the foundational principle of republicanism with a small r, right? A republic should be, those first two cardinal rules of Montesquieu should be small. How do you keep any club tight? Not by keeping it small only, but small and univocal. So I think that might be sort of a part of the Benedict option. The other half of the Benedict option, I think is really bad. I disfavor it. It's more like burying your head in sand. I think what we need to do at this point is balkanize. And maybe that's part of it. People argue about what he's really saying in that book. We do need to gather with other like-minded people. People like me in California, look, I'm getting out of the state. I'm leaving, right? I will be leaving. My hometown, most conservative place in California, is essentially running me out after this. I mean, literally all the bad press I got over the last week. I was out of town. I went to the desert last weekend, and I was just my phone was buzzing every 5 seconds. And it's like, this is the most conservative place. And they're slandering me as a racist, even though I had just published a book, one of whose rules is racism has no place on the emerging American right. So we need to get with each other in some good place. But I don't think that's what I object to about the Benedict option is surrendering the fight, the Flandersiness of it. Pray your rosary, pray them beads, man. But the rosary is also a weapon, right? It's the non-sword hand weapon of the fighters, and we don't use swords anymore. Everyone needs to have lots of guns and lots of ammo and lots of friends that are, book 8, Nicomachean Ethics, true friends, true friendship is based on mutual virtue, and that's why you need to gather with them. You need to live around them, have a plan, have a bug out bag, have food. Like, we don't want to, like General Patton says, Dave quotes him in the book, patriotism is good when you die for your country. It's better when you make the other son of a bitch die for his country. That's what we wanted. That's what we want to do if it comes to blows. If it's a just war, then so be it. Let's win it on behalf of the Lord. That's what was beautiful about the Crusades, all of which, aside from the Fourth Crusade, were just wars.
Right on. Yeah, and here's Matt Baker, personal friend of mine, says, asking about the secession. We've already had a secession in Seattle. I believe Portland has another mini country as well. He says, given the secession talk, do you think there's any chance of that growing larger? And it just occurred to me also, Tim, while we were talking about this, is that we already do have an arrangement with the American Indian tribes, where there's dozens and dozens of them where they are actually autonomous countries de facto. I mean, they've got their own police force. It's like a new country when you go into a reservation territory. Right. I believe the largest is the Navajo in the Southwest area. Maybe that's a model for some kind of secession movement. I don't know. But what do you comment on the new states we already have in the autonomous zone in Seattle, the communist utopia over there. And do you think the secession movement could actually become something?
I don't know, because I favor it. The left favors it. I think we could shake hands in midfield, at the 50-yard line, and be like, dude, go your own way. Now, the powers that be, particularly on the left, they understand the tax structure, how it works. 2% create 97% of the jobs or something like that. These people, they're really busy vilifying. So they could not form a nation of the People's Republic of Santa Monica or whatever. They couldn't form this new green Marxist movement on the backs of their constituency, who just don't bring in the wealth. So they might be, the Soros front groups like BLM and Antifa and all the goofballs, dangerous goofballs, but goofballs in Portland and Seattle. They might let them talk a mean game about this because it sounds kind of cutting edge and intimidating, and I actually favor it. We can agree, let's all go our own ways. But the powers that be on the left would never let it happen, because Marxists need these so-called capitalists, the people supplying the capital. So it's all just demagogy when it comes out of the mouth of the left. Now, with me, I mean it. Like, let's all agree. We can do it right now with people in the live chat. I say, man, let's go to Mississippi or Alabama or Idaho or something like that. These are three of my favorite states, and like I'm looking to get there anyway. So it's a real thing, but it's not real off the mouth of the left. Remember, the issue is never the issue with the left. They're pure liars.
Yeah, James Marone, and that's kind of what you were saying a little bit. He says the Fed won't let any states leave the union. Do you remember what happened last time the South tried to? Uncle Sam said, nah, caused the most horrific war. Yeah, obviously the South is rebelling on the cause of slavery. And it's not just a black and white thing. Everybody kind of makes the Civil War out to this, North is the heroes, which is not true. Neither with the South, it's not black and white. But obviously they did try to secede, and they obviously successfully did. They made a new country, and basically they were actually invoking Thomas Jefferson, and they were invoking 1776 for all the evil of slavery and everything. But it was crushed as much as possible by the federal government. As you say, that was sort of the beginning of the end because of the rise of the federal government, the 14th Amendment. I mean, I definitely see the military threat, the political threat, as quickly quashing any type of attempt such as this, like you're saying.
Well, remember, it's not so. The prelude to civil war, when it's peaceable, is lies in the ideas of Jefferson and Madison, and two very important texts. Both of them refer to a doctrine of nullification. Nullification is when the states just say the federal government is become a Leviathan tyrant. They're trying to rule from the center. That's not what the United States of America were about. The United States of America was all about subsidiarity, state legislatures having all the important powers represented in Article 1, Section 8, and Article 1, Section 9, Article 1, Section 10 of the U.S. Constitution. And nullification went like this. Everyone go read it. Give yourself a little weekend reading assignment. Jefferson's Kentucky resolutions, he lays out how nullification would work. It's very peaceable. It's just essentially all of the government actors in the state legislature and the state executive of Kentucky not doing the onerous commandeered functions ordered from the center, from the top, from the Fed. And Madison has a different word for nullification. I forget what it is in a document called the Virginia Resolutions. But he's just saying, look, this is tyranny. This is tyranny. The states are supposed to function under self-determination. And so they're both writing in the same direction. So
yeah, and I think it's a very difficult hill to climb, particularly because, I see historically, the Civil War being the nullification being squashed at that time, and then 100 years later, you have the Civil Rights Movement, where the South is still trying to impose their evil laws, which are also crushed by the federal government. So in both cases, the federal government gains power and moral prestige because they're actually fighting against some evil that's actually there. And so it's a difficult legacy that they've already built for the federal government in sort of these just causes, as we can all admit, with slavery and Jim Crow.
Right. That's the kicker. Yeah.
Yeah. So let me add one final question I want to ask you is, how do you see the future in overcoming the collectivist takeover? I do see Biden and Pelosi distancing themselves from the defund the police movement, which seems, I don't know how distant they really are. They seem to be trying to co-opt, like they always do, the Black Lives Matter and everything, but they came out and said they don't support defunding the police. What do you see? What should we do to prevent this collectivist takeover? Is it just going to fizzle out? These millennials or 20-somethings creating their utopia and probably not having enough food because they're rejecting the free market and whatnot. How do we guard against this for our families, just on a practical level?
Well, we refer to something called the ratchet effect in constitutional law. Once these powers are given to the center, to the Fed, that they're never supposed to have, the entire United States Constitution is predicated on the idea that, Article 1, Section 8, that the Fed is never supposed to have these powers, to the 10th Amendment, as we call the police powers, the state legislatures have the ability to regulate health, safety, welfare, morals, and security. That's supposed to happen at the state level. And remember, they were thinking of states as more like the size of, the northeastern states. So they were actually subsidiary in their inception. So it's proper, appropriate, very American, and reflects, I think, a proper understanding of American Bellarminian constitutionalism to say something like, I'm a libertarian at the federal level, and I am a Catholic conservative at the state level, where all the muscular laws should be made. It's fine to regulate health, safety, welfare, moral security. At the state level, it's the appropriate forum for so doing. And that's just been perverted by the 14th Amendment, which was allegedly necessitated by the Civil War, by slavery. So you see how it's kind of the national. When you understand the 14th Amendment from a proper constitutional perspective, the overturning of really all of the first 10 amendments, the overturning of really all of the 3 articles of the Constitution, which say Article 1, what the Congress is allowed to do, Article 2, what the president's allowed to do, Article 3, what the judiciary is allowed to do. It's a total federal takeover of the corresponding branches at the state level. And it's the ratchet effect. You can't get it back once that power is given, which is why I'm rather certain that things just, since the end of the Civil War, have just accelerated in terms of their centralization. And we're never going to get them back, meaning it's not a true 3-branch republic, meaning we don't have imperium and imperio, true federalism, meaning we can't have subsidiarity, meaning we pretty much need a reboot. I end up getting into these arguments with the integralists and the post-liberals, not about whether or not the whole thing is I'd use an earthier term again, whether the whole thing is screwed up. I get into these arguments with post-liberals and integralists as to whether or not getting screwed up was a fait accompli on account of liberal, in the good sense, liberal republicanism. I say, right. They say yes. They say it was baked into the cake from the outset. I said no. We made some really bad ideas, and we had some really Protestant misunderstandings of liberty. Because remember, Protestants don't believe in liberty. They believe our will is determined, like Martin Luther and John Calvin. And I say this screwed the whole thing up, but except it only happened in history, and we could have done a longer lasting, we're a short-lived republic if this is really the end. And I believe we're coming to the end. We are teenagers. I'm trying to think. The Venetian Republic lasted about 1,100 years. The English Republic lasted about 1,200 years. Even the late Roman Empire lasted 600 or 700 years. The Swiss cantons lasted 800 or 900 years. So to have this little run in the sun of 250 years is premature, right? And it's really a shameful thing.
Yeah, and there's just one more question I wanted to get here, because this is a really good question. Do the Gordon brothers have a critique on capitalism? And this is kind of a huge question, so go where you like with this, but especially, what's your take on neoconservatism and the U.S. foreign policy favoring Israel? I never heard him address it. I mean, I would guess you probably are anti-neocon because it's big government. Am I right?
Right. Remember, neoconservatism, you're not going to hear this on Twitter. Neoconservatism has its policy on Israel, which that's all anyone uses it to mean, uses it to designate. But what it was is William Kristol's dad, Irving Kristol, and a few other defectors from the Democrat Party in the early 70s came over calling themselves neocons. And they're the ones that brought from the Democrat Party, this is the exact opposite of the story you'll hear on Twitter, deficit spending, favoring entitlements and bailouts like TARP, favoring a kind of Keynesianism, bringing it into the Republican Party for cop-out neocons like the Bush family. Nixon was a bad neocon. He favored, Nixon was the first guy to put forward really Romney Care or Obamacare. And of course, Bob Dole, really the muscle in the 70s Republican machine. They all incorporated this neoconservatism. When we talk about it domestically, it is the ideas of Keynesianism. Paleocons are, well, they're not libertarians, but they're much closer to libertarian than they are to Keynesianism economically. So, and then neoconservatism gets complex when you go to a broad policy in Israel and all that. That's not really an area of expertise. But it doesn't only mean Israel. The critique on capitalism is I got this from Max Weber. The spirit of whatever it's called, the Protestant spirit of capitalism or whatever.
Yeah.
He quotes a guy named Baxter, who says, wealth is not bad if it's worn about the shoulders like a light cloak. Wealth only becomes bad if it's allowed to become an iron cage. So my whole thing, and I'm not a wealthy man myself, but the importance of wealth as it figures into these discussions is, if you can part with it at a moment's notice, right, then it's not evil. Also, we have these deeply Protestant understandings of wealth in America, which screwed up American capitalism. So did Keynesianism and the neocons. They brought in all this tax and spend, deficit spending, TARP, bailout, entitlements, all this crap. That's not free enterprise. So I distinguish between free enterprise and capitalism. Capitalism has all these Protestant misunderstandings and all these Keynesian anti-free enterprise misunderstandings. And free enterprise would just be essentially, I don't know. Imagine two kids going out to set up a lemonade stand, right? What's the price of that commodity of lemonade they're trying to sell people? They go out there and, like every kid, at first they say, this is great. We've got all the capital from mom and dad, the water and the sugar and the lemons. Let's just sell these cups for $500 a glass. It's the state of nature that market commodity, a glass of lemonade, nature dictates they will not be able to get $500 a glass. You don't need a government actor to come in there and fix the price of lemonade, like Joseph Stalin fixing the price of steel, right? What drives the price down, even in these little kids' minds? No cars stop. Then they might go to the opposite extreme and a penny a glass, and cars are stopping really often. They're like, we could jack the price up. And you equivocate and you find the natural, it is a spectrum. It's not an exact figure. Some people will pay what others won't. It's a spectrum, but nature does select it. Aristotle talks about this in book 5 of the Nicomachean Ethics. He says very explicitly, how is a cobbler to trade with a cook or something like that? Shoes are worth more than food. Shoes are worth more than homes. That's the need for money. So we allow, the basic idea of free enterprise is that people are their own best actors in economics, in marketplaces. So we allow people to dictate their own needs. We trade on money, and we don't need a government overlord to come in to tell us how many shoes to buy or what kind to buy or what the price of shoes are. The market selects, okay, lemonade's worth about whatever, 75 cents a glass or whatnot.
Yeah, right on. Okay, well, let's wrap up. Tim, thanks so much for coming on. Do you have any final thoughts, final word on retrogradism or the movement? Any final word?
Yeah, please. If people are so inclined, I was essentially, because of this new nuanced viewpoint discrimination, I was persecuted. And if people are interested in helping out, don't go to GoFundMe. I had some people go on there at first, and they froze the accounts right away because I'm a conservative. They're they're bailing people out of prisons that are setting buildings on fire. Go to timothyjgordon.com. There's a donate button there. And if you can't do that, please just buy Rules for Retrogrades. It's, I think, on sale now on Tan Books. I really appreciate your time. I appreciate you having me on, Tim, and I'd love it if you would come on our podcast sometime soon.
Sure, man. Yeah, it's been a good conversation. We need to continue to talk about how do we solve this problem called the leftist Marxist takeover, whatever this is, and definitely stick together and band together in this one war. So let's pray on Our Father. Let's pray for the conversion of Trump to the Catholic faith, the re-election of Trump, the success of this war, and remember the people who are suffering. I mean, thinking about all these business owners who lost their livelihood from these riots or just COVID-19 or whatever. Just remember your neighbors, meet your neighbors, support them. Elderly who've been shut up in nursing homes, visit them, FaceTime them, whatever. Let's stick together and support each other. So let's pray in Our Father, and we'll call it a night here. Let me pull up my Pantocrator. Name of the Father, Son, the Holy Ghost. Amen. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven.
Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil.
Amen. Name of the Father, Son, Holy Ghost. Amen.